All right, so sorry for the little hiccup last week. We skipped what was planned to be the fourth reading, so that we're going to do this today of Alexander Hamilton's report on the subject of manufacturers. We've been through a lot. All of the previous week's readings, including the original document, which we're all working through, is going to be available in the description box of this video. Needless to say, the general essence is just as potent today and important today as it was back in 1791 when this debate was really happening in a very heated way over what would be the course of America's destiny coming out of the new American Revolution. Would America remain a nation dependent upon foreign powers for the effects of manufacturing, remaining always just an agrarian society doing just simply food and manual labor without machinery for the foreign markets, and that would be it, which was the position that was taken by people like Thomas Jefferson and many, many others who were believers in and followers of the theories of Adam Smith and the British School of Economics? Or would it take the course of becoming a manufacturing nation such that it would have both access to agriculture and as well as manufacturing factories, the means of producing the tools that would also be used by the farmers? So up until now, we've gone through many different lines of argumentation, which should be self-evident. Like, yeah, of course, you'd think like, yeah, duh, you should have it's better to have a full spectrum economy, but apparently it wasn't that self-evident. And according to the past 40 years of self-induced mutilation of our own economies under globalization, these are lessons which we have forgotten. So how do you get it back? What is the logic of bringing in a type of credit system that would allow for the creation of capital to be invested into the infrastructure, into the creation of new industries that had never existed, the training of new people, or the training of people to have skill sets? All of these things, you know, the question was always, where is the money going to come from? If we don't have that money, how are you going to do it? How are you going to be able to think that far ahead? Because it takes time to invest in something brand new that you've never done before. You might have to wait 5-10 years before it actually starts producing real wealth. But does that mean it's not worth it? No, not at all. It's absolutely worth it. That's why it's even more important. And that's the heart of the Chinese success. If you want to look at like the past 30 years of how did China go leapfrog like 300 years of development that it took us to do, they were able to do it from the 1970s up to the present in a very short, dense period of time, because they were using this is what should be common sense knowledge, basic principles of economic reality. So I think with that, like I said, I'm skipping a lot. So if people do want to check out some of the previous lectures to get some of the more detail, that'll be easily available. And like usual, we'll just do reading. Anybody can stop, ask a question. This language is not easy, so if people want to just unpack something, that's fine. Share screen. Oh, hitting the wrong thing there. Let's try that again. Okay, do people see that?
Yep.
Yep, okay, good. So I'll make it a little bit bigger. Ooh, too big. All right. So I guess we can go for, he's going through the objections. So yeah, I think going from the top of page 31 of 63 is fine. Who would like to read today?
I would like to, but I have such a problem reading on this cell phone.
Yeah, I hear you, man. Don't worry about it. It's cool.
You know me, Matthew. I'll always volunteer.
Okay. So you can do definitely. So Paul, kick it off, and then like I said, your reading voice is beautiful, Paul. Just go slow, and little stops between paragraphs is always the best.
From the top of the page?
Sure.
Okay. It is a reflection, which may with propriety be indulged here, that this eventual diminution of the prices of manufactured articles, which is the result of internal manufacturing establishment, has a direct and very important tendency to benefit agriculture. It enables the farmer to procure with a smaller quantity of his labour the manufactured produce of which he stands in need, and consequently increases the value of his income and property. The objections which are commonly made to the expediency of encouraging and to the probability of succeeding in manufacturing pursuits in the United States, having now been discussed, the considerations which have appeared in the course of the discussion recommending that species of industry to the patronage of the government will be materially strengthened by a few general and some particular topics which have been naturally reserved for subsequent notice. There seems to be a moral certainty that the trade of a country which is both manufacturing and agricultural will be more lucrative and prosperous than that of a country which is merely agricultural. Hear, hear. One reason for this is found in that general effort of nations, which has been already mentioned, to procure from their own soils the articles of prime necessity requisite to their own consumption and use, and which serves to render their demand for a foreign supply of such articles in a great degree occasional and contingent. Hence, while the necessities of nations exclusively devoted to agriculture, for the fabrics of manufacturing states are constant and regular, the wants of the latter for the products of the former are liable to vary considerably. I think that's vary.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, to very considerable fluctuations and interruptions. The great inequalities resulting from difference of seasons have been elsewhere remarked. This uniformity of demand on one side and unsteadiness of it on the other must necessarily have a tendency to cause the general course of the exchange of commodities between the parties to turn to the disadvantage of the merely agricultural states. Peculiarity of situation, climate and soil adapted to the production of peculiar commodities may sometimes contradict the rule, but there is every reason to believe that it will be found in the main a just one. Another circumstance which gives a superiority of commercial advantages to states another circumstance which gives a superiority of commercial advantages to states that manufacture as well as cultivate consists in the more numerous attractions which a more diversified market offers to foreign customers and greater scope which it affords to mercantile enterprise. It is a position of indisputable truth in commerce, depending too on very obvious reasons, that the greatest resort will ever be to those marts where commodities, while equally abundant, are most various. Each difference of kind holds out an additional inducement, and it is a position not less clear that the field of enterprise must be enlarged to the merchants of a country in proportion to the variety as well as the abundance of commodities which they find at home for exportation to foreign markets. A third circumstance, perhaps not inferior to either of the other two, conferring the superiority which has been stated, has relation to the stagnations of demand for certain commodities, which at some time or other interfere more or less with the sale of all. The nation which can bring to market but few articles is likely to be more quickly and sensibly affected by such stagnations than one which is always possessed of a great variety of commodities. The former frequently finds too great a proportion of its stock of materials for sale or exchange lying on hand, or is obliged to make injurious sacrifices to supply its wants of foreign articles, which are numerous and urgent in proportion to the smallness of the number of its own. The latter commonly finds itself indemnified by the high prices of some articles for the low prices of others, and the prompt and advantageous sale of those articles which are in demand enables its merchant the better to wait for a favourable change in respect to those which are not. There is ground to believe that a difference of situation in this particular has immensely different effects upon the wealth and prosperity of nations. From these circumstances collectively, two important inferences are to be drawn. One, that there is always a higher probability of a favourable balance of trade in regard to countries in which manufactures founded on the basis of a thriving agriculture flourish, than in regard to those which are confined wholly or almost wholly to agriculture. The other, which is also a consequence of the first, that countries of the former description are likely to possess more pecuniary wealth or money than those of the latter. Facts appear to correspond with this conclusion. The importations of manufactured supplies seem invariably to drain the merely agricultural people of their wealth. Let the situation of the manufacturing countries of Europe be compared in this particular with that of countries which only cultivate, and the disparity will be striking. Other causes, it is true, help to account for this disparity between some of them, and among these causes, the relative state of agriculture. But between others of them, the most prominent circumstances of dissimilitude arises from the comparative state of manufactures. In corroboration of the same idea, it ought not to escape remark that the West Indies Islands, the soils of which are the most fertile, and the nation, which in the greatest degree supplies the rest of the world with the precious metals, exchange to a loss with almost every other country. As far as experience at home may guide, it will lead to the same conclusion. Previous to the revolution, the quantity of coin possessed by the colonies, which now compose the United States, appeared to be inadequate to their circulation, and their debt to Great Britain was progressive. Since the revolution, the states in which manufactures have most increased have recovered fastest from the injuries of the late war and abound most in pecuniary resources. It ought to be admitted, however, in this, as in the preceding case, that causes irrelative to the state of manufactures account in a degree for the phenomena remarked. The continual progress of new settlements has a natural tendency to occasion an unfavourable balance of trade, though it indemnifies for the inconvenience by that increase of the national capital which flows from the conversion of waste into improved lands. And the different degrees of external commerce which are carried on by the different states may make material differences in the comparative state of their wealth. The first circumstance has reference to the deficiency of coin and the increase of debt. Sorry, Matthew. Previous to the revolution. The last to the advantages which the most manufacturing states appear to have enjoyed over the others since the termination of the late war. But the uniform appearance of an abundance of specie as the concomitant of a flourishing state of manufactures and of the reverse, where they do not prevail, afford a strong presumption of their favourable operation upon the wealth of a country. Not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufactures. Every nation, with a view to those great objects, ought to endeavour to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. These comprise the means of subsistent habitation, clothing, and defence. The possession of these is necessary to the perfection of the body politic, to the safety as well as to the welfare of the society. The want of either is the want of an important organ of political life and motion, and in the various crises which await a state, it must severely feel the effects of any such deficiency. The extreme embarrassments of the United States during the late war, from an incapacity of supplying themselves, are still a matter of keen reflection. A future war might be expected again to exemplify the mischiefs and dangers of a situation to which that capacity is still in too great a degree applicable, unless changed by timely and vigorous exertion. To effect this change as fast as shall be prudent merits all the attention and all the zeal of our public councils. 'Tis the next great work to be accomplished.
So far, do people generally get the gist of his message so far in the past 2 pages?
I had a hard time paying attention to all of it, but I picked up on two. One was, which I think we already covered before, is to do manufacturing in addition to agriculture is better than just doing one. And the second one, just recently he made, was that you want to have the basics of your country should be able to at least make some of the basics, which I'm guessing would probably be food, energy, some things like that. The rest of it kind of I had a hard time focusing on.
I think the other point to take note of is that not only manufacturing is important, but variety in manufacturing.
Yeah.
The more variety you have in your manufacturing, the better off you're going to be, because he talked a little bit about supply chain problems in one particular area, let's say, that can have a massive effect on an economy that's reliant on that alone. I think he quoted the 2 examples of sugar and mining from
The Indies.
Caribbean nations.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
also mentioned that you need to defend your country as well.
Yeah, it's not just
That's
well.
what I was going to say. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if he's going to say it in this paper, but the way he was alluding to the problems they faced, the United States faced at the time of the revolution, he mentions in one of the reports, and I think it's in this one, but we haven't gone into it. He states that basically it's good if you have farmers, it's good if you produce your food. Now, if you're in a war, you're not going to be able to buy the musket and the powder from your enemy. That's a bad idea. You better be producing them, right? So that's also like, and since the war was not far, in the past, at that point in 1791, people like probably got to get a
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very visceral memory that people had. Even the ones who were philosophically in opposition to him, they were like, "Yeah, it's true. We did just do that, and we would have been crushed. We couldn't produce our own material. It's true. Yeah, good point." Yeah.
There's another point that you could make here, and of course, it's not related to Hamilton necessarily. I'm talking about events in the 20th century or whatever. But after the Civil War, massive growth in the American economy, and particularly after the First World War and the Second World War, an amazing growth in the American economy in white goods and things like that in particular, which you could argue, and I think it's true to a degree, was directly resulted a direct result of the militarization, if you like, of the American economy. Now, you look at the 50s and the 60s, and America led the world in terms of per capita income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was a big upside. Much more wealth for many, many people. But what has it led to? I mean, you have the situation now where that military expenditure has taken over the American economy and now dominates. And I'm not sure what the percentage is exactly, but I think the American budget is, more than 50% of the entire annual American budget goes to the military. Now, that's a downside. That's a real as we're seeing in the world at the moment, that's for sure.
How would you, what are your thoughts on that, Pascal?
I mean, what he was saying before and what, Pascal alluded to there, yes, you do have to produce things, for the safety of the nation, et cetera, but that can, and I would suggest the example that I'm giving here is an evidence of that. That can go too far as well.
Sure.
I mean, it all depends on what your aims are.
Well, I was thinking about this a little bit, and like the, I don't know if Pascal, if you have a thought you want to kick in, or I was just going to say something about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was just going to quote John Quincy Adams, I think. He was also saying, don't, the United States shouldn't go fighting monsters
right
over the world, right? They or create monsters to fight with all around the world. So I think that's part of the issue now, that we've seen in the 20th century. So it's good to defend yourself, but like you said, Paul, you don't just like put all your income into producing weapons.
It has consequences if you do, yes.
Yeah.
I'm really talking
having a debate. Oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I'm really talking economic consequences.
Yeah. I was having a debate with somebody actually who hated Hamilton, and the point that he had made to me in the course of it was a very friendly debate. He had said that because Hamilton had spearheaded the creation of a standing army, without Hamilton's work, there would not have been a standing army inside of the United States. Thus, Hamilton is bad because look at what the American army did over the course of all of the centuries, or at least especially the 20th century, and so much destruction. And it's like, well, yeah, but you got to blame Hamilton for the misuse. Like, he created a tool and a weapon. Now the weapon could be used, like Pascal was saying, or you were saying, Paul, like it could be used defensively, as you would be a fool in this world of oligarchy to like not have an ability to defend yourself. And just because the tool could be abused doesn't make the tool bad. It makes the decisions and the lack of wisdom and selfishness bad. And this person they refused to accept that line of argumentation. They're like, no, it would have been better if the US just never had the ability to defend itself. It's like, well, yeah, but then there never would have been a United States. And he seemed to like the United States. So like, well,
So the Second
That seems
Amendment is
incredibly
almost-
simplistic to me.
Yeah.
The Second Amendment is almost kind of more like the Articles of Confederation, maybe, where, because if we didn't have that standing army, we really couldn't probably be a nation and defend ourselves, just like without the bank.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
well, that's actually going to be the topic of the class on Sunday. We're going to have a friend of ours who's also a lawyer. Actually, it makes him pretty well placed. He's going to go through the articles of the fight over the Articles of Confederation and what it was lacking, why it was insufficient to deal with the reality of the world that these people were living through, and the importance of constitutional law that was brought online, largely through this. I mean, which you can't understand how the Constitution was a success if you don't look at the role of both Franklin and Hamilton. Played a much bigger role than people realize in that process.
I do wonder, though, if their primary concern was that the military was going to be used on their own people, if it was a standing military, or what was the balance of concern as far as it being used imperially or what?
Sunday,
Yeah.
class on Sunday. Cool.
So I
Yeah.
didn't quite. I'm
Sorry, Joyce?
Yeah, I didn't quite understand the bit about the West Indies having most of the fertile land and also the exports and ore and everything, but not doing as well. And what was the point that Hamilton was making there?
That they had no manufacturing. So he's like, let's compare the countries in Europe who actually do have manufacturing to countries that have not been permitted to have factories or production of anything other than raw materials, like agriculture and like metals that are produced directly from mines, but nothing else. And he's like, the West Indies is super weak. It's completely impoverished. It's prone to all sorts of manipulation. It has no ability to stand on its own 2 feet. Whereas countries that can produce for themselves don't have that problem, and they don't have all of their eggs in one basket. You know,
So I would say weak by design, wouldn't you? I mean, did he
weak by
address
design.
that?
Yeah, weak. It's what he's sort of getting at and alluding to in all of his. People back then typically don't. They speak with more subtlety than our world today. But I mean, everybody knows he's talking about the British Empire and the British East India Company.
Okay.
I think the other aspect of that, and it's merely an economic one too, that those producers, the Caribbean islands or whatever they're producing, they are to some degree at the mercy of who they're selling to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, price control and everything like that. I mean, if they're at the mercy of the British Empire, et cetera, then it doesn't matter how much they dig up their ground and produce something that has a demand and everything like that. They're never going to achieve economic independence because they are literally at the mercy of those that they're selling to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if something goes wrong.
No,
Sorry, was that Pascal?
I was just going to point out Susan has been lifting her arm for a long time. I think she has something to say.
The subject has changed a little now, but
Oh, I'm sorry, Susan. I couldn't even see you on my screen. I didn't know you were doing that. Okay.
that's okay. I'm not sure how many of you guys are in the United States, but especially talking about how much of our budget goes to the military and making weapons. So many of y'all's discussions just remind me of, I think it was John Adams that said that our Constitution is wholly insufficient for any but a moral and religious people.
That is beautiful.
When we let people who are immoral hold these positions of power, they take us off target, down the wrong road.
Exactly. That's key. That's key. Yeah. It only works. A constitutional republic only works if people actually are moral. If they aren't, no such thing. The idea of democracy, it can't work. Yeah. So now we're getting
That's the prime battle that we face these days.
Yeah.
That really is the principal battle.
Yeah. What do you think, Kelly?
I was just gonna say the gist of it, what I got so far from Hamilton is he's telling everyone, if you're gonna have a sovereign country, you have to have, like, basically be self-sufficient, having your own means of production, growing your own food, making your own clothes, stuff like that, just so you could survive as a country without any other, without relying on other countries. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, exactly. And also it makes for the type of trade you are, because you're always going to have intercourse and trade with with other neighboring countries, but it'll make it
Exactly.
such that the trade you're going to have is going to be actually on parity. You're going to have fair trade so that it's like the excess, you're going to produce enough for yourselves. And then whatever excess you produce in abundance is going to be the basis upon which you market that and sell it to your other neighbors in need. And same thing for them to you. So the basis upon which won't be one of scarcity, it'll be one of abundance. And that's a type of economy and a type of capitalism that's based on creation and not simply consumption of diminishing returns. Very different world that you're living in at that point,
Yeah, I see it like as a child, you're raising a child to grow up to be self-sufficient, and then you're out on your own, and
exactly.
and then you can change the rules.
Nobody wants their kid to be
point.
dependent on them forever, right? When you're like 45 years old, still living at home, and it's like no parent really wants that. They want their kid to be able to walk and be functional on their own.
And then just live their life.
Yeah, exactly.
I can give a good example here in relation to the country that I come from, originally Australia. I mean, we're known, for our extractive industries, all of the mining, et cetera, et cetera. We supply an awful lot of coal, uranium, and various other things, which was climate change agenda, of course, is going to cost us. But we had an opportunity, had we so chosen as a nation, to, instead of simply digging crap up out of the ground, mostly financed by foreign countries who pay no tax, foreign companies rather, who pay no tax, we could have developed a manufacturing industry based on value adding the stuff that we were digging up out of the ground, rather than sending steel ore to other countries. We could have developed a better steel industry. We could have developed a multitude of products that would have served the nation well, but also for better trade, quality of exports, if you like. But we just didn't. And I remember when these things were being discussed in the 70s and 80s, et cetera, all of a sudden neoliberalism raised its ugly head. Everything got privatized. And with privatization, the one thing that you get, or that I've certainly seen in Australia, is that the companies, international companies particularly, that come in and buy those assets don't necessarily want to invest in more productive use of those assets for the benefit of the home economy. All they want is profit. So they minimize all of that. And we've seen it in the transport industry, particularly, the way, in New South Wales, they bought a bunch of trains that barely even fit on the train lines that are breaking down all over the place. I mean, there is a massive stupidity there, and, billions of dollars gone to waste. Whereas when I was a kid, right through until my 20s, we made our own trains. We led the world in a lot of telecommunications products. And I'm thinking of the old rotary phones and stuff like that, but we were world leaders because the industries were owned by the public, and a lot of money, some money anyway, went back into research and development and the creation of better variations of the products, the essential products that were being used, and research into, better communications, et cetera, et cetera. Once privatization came in, that all stopped. And literally billions, trillions of dollars by now was extracted out of the Australian economy and went overseas. It did not service the interests of the community.
That has been the trend.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an example of a lost opportunity, and one that's not necessarily obvious when it's undertaken.
Yeah,
the prevailing attitude of the day was neoliberalism. So we did what Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan suggested we should do.
Yep.
Well, that brings up the question of what should be nationalized. Like, this paper is talking about production, but he's talking about sort of ownership or operation of things, like the infrastructure, I guess. I
I
don't
think he
know.
mentions the term essential industry. So yeah, you'd have to define what they are.
Mhm.
And that could either be a very narrow range or a very wide range.
Yeah.
You know, food,
Paul?
clothing, education.
Paul, what country are you in now?
I'm in the Philippines.
I love your accent.
Very exotic, Paul.
Not back in Melbourne, mate. It's as ordinary as anything.
Yeah, David. No, but you're right. I mean, this is something which there's no formula. I think that's the thing. And then we should get back to the Hamilton rating, but there's no formula really for like what will always work in all contexts, because context always defines also what is possible. And also like sometimes if your culture, if you've got a really strong culture and at different moments, right, our cultures get more moral and less moral, more confused and better at different times in history, right? So if you've got a very advanced people that are moving in a good maturing direction, they've got a strong compass that is part of their world, then you can generally find that you could trust them to make their own decisions individually, and they will generally make decisions that are in alignment with the welfare of their society as a whole. At other times, where people become increasingly corrupted, largely by the influence of certain, as we know, imperial oligarchical forces that are very good at making people dumb and stupid and myopic, then in such situations, it doesn't necessarily work to just let everybody, to give people like the ability to just do whatever they want. And you might want to have more nationalized processes until things get better to a certain threshold. So there's always like this, like they say, politics and economics is sort of downstream from culture. Culture is everything. And
Great.
yeah.
I see. Yep.
I would emphasize again what Susan said before, that everything goes astray when there is no morality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we keep talking. It's very juicy, right? This is the type of stuff that this is why it's hard to finish in Hamilton paper, because it keeps on sparking a well of discussion. So yeah, let's keep going to the issue of, I think he's going to talk about the Navy a little bit here, and we'll see what he does.
Can you scroll it down? That's it, just the first line there. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
The want of a navy to protect our external commerce, as long as it shall continue, must render it a peculiarly precarious reliance for the supply of essential articles, and must serve to strengthen prodigiously the arguments in favour of manufactures. To these general considerations are added some of a more particular nature. Our distance from Europe, the great fountain of manufactured supply, subjects us in the existing state of things to inconvenience and loss in two ways. The bulkiness of these commodities, which are the chief productions of the soil, necessarily imposes very heavy charges on their transportation to distant markets. These charges, in the cases in which the nations to whom our products are sent maintain a competition in the supply of their own markets, principally fall upon us and form material deductions from the primitive value of the articles furnished. The charges on manufactured supplies brought from Europe are greatly enhanced by the same circumstance of distance. These charges, again, in the cases in which our own industry maintains no competition in our own markets, also principally fall upon us, and are an additional cause of extraordinary deduction from the primitive value of our own products, these being the materials of exchange for the foreign fabrics which we consume. The equality and moderation of individual property and the growing settlements of new districts occasion in this country an unusual demand for coarse manufactures, the charges of which, being greater in proportion to their greater bulk, augment the disadvantage which has just been described. Need to scroll up. Thanks, Matthew. As in most countries, domestic supplies maintain a very considerable competition with such foreign productions of the soil as are imported for sale. If the extensive establishment of manufactories in the United States does not create a similar competition in respect to manufactured articles, it appears to be clearly deducible from the considerations which have been mentioned that they must sustain a double loss in their exchanges with foreign nations, strongly conducive to an unfavourable balance of trade and very prejudicial to their interests. These disadvantages press with no small weight on the landed interest of the country. In seasons of peace, they cause a serious deduction from the intrinsic value of the products of the soil, In the time of a war, which should either involve ourselves or another nation, possessing a considerable share of our carrying trade, the charges on the transportation of our commodities, bulky as most of them are, could hardly fail to prove a grievous burden to the farmer, while obliged to depend in so great degree as he now does upon foreign markets for the vent of the surplus of his labour. As far as the prosperity of the fisheries of the United States is impeded by the want of an adequate market, there arises another special reason for desiring the extension of manufactures. Besides the fish, which in many places would be likely to make part of the subsistence of the persons employed, it is known that the oils, bones, and skins of marine animals are of extensive use in various manufactures, hence the prospect of an additional demand for the produce of the fisheries. One more point of view only remains in which to consider the expediency of encouraging manufactures in the United States. It is not uncommon to meet with an opinion that though the promoting of manufacturers may be the interest of part of the Union, it is contrary to that of another part. The northern and southern regions are sometimes represented as having adverse interests in this respect. Those are called manufacturing, these agricultural states. And a species of opposition is imagined to subsist between the manufacturing and agricultural interests. Interesting reference there, isn't it? When you think ahead to the Civil War.
Well, but this was understood. See, it wasn't like it should have been a surprise in the 1850s that, we're in a civil war now. It was like that was understood back in the at this time that this is going to lead to an unbridgeable conflict if it's not resolved fast.
This idea of an opposition between those two interests is the common error of the early periods of every country, but experience gradually dissipates it. Indeed, they are perceived so often to succor and to befriend each other that they come at length to be considered as one, a supposition which has been frequently abused and is not universally true. Particular encouragements of particular manufactures may be of a nature to sacrifice the interests of landholders to those of manufacturers, but it is nevertheless a maxim well established by experience and generally acknowledged, where there has been sufficient experience that the aggregate prosperity of manufactures and the aggregate prosperity of agriculture are intimately connected. In the course of the discussion which has had place, various weighty considerations have been adduced operating in support of that maxim. Perhaps the superior steadiness of the demand of a domestic market for the surplus produce of the soil is alone a convincing argument of its truth. Ideas of a contrariety of interest, there's an interesting word, of interests between the northern and southern regions of the Union are in the main as unfounded as they are mischievous. The diversity of circumstances on which such contrariety is usually predicated authorizes a directly contrary conclusion. Mutual wants constitute one of the strongest links of political connection, and the extent of these bears a natural proportion to the diversity in the means of mutual supply. Suggestions of an opposite complexion are ever to be deplored, as unfriendly to the steady pursuit of one great common cause and to the perfect harmony of all the parts.
I need to say something very quickly on this as a historical point of interest, is that if you think about what Hamilton is dealing with as far as the fifth columnist, like the early stage deep state inside of the United States, who was the primary leader of that at that time in the 1790s?
Aaron Burr.
It was Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr was already known to have been colluding and conspiring to create a situation whereby the northern states that had manufacturing were supposed to break away and set up their own confederation, independent of the southern states that were completely dependent upon agriculture and cotton, and they were supposed to become their own separate confederacy. As early as as far as I could tell, it was even in the 1796 period, according to the research by Jerry Therrien, who just produced a second book on Canadian history. But there was already the first effort to break apart the Union, even back then, led by Aaron Burr, which culminated in an effort by, I think it was in 1800 when he was running for the presidency, but he needed to become the president for this to work. And that's why Hamilton, subverting Burr, and defending Jefferson as the president, which ended up succeeding. It was a narrow margin, right? That completely changed the entire chemistry. And that plan to break up the Union, which wasn't supposed to just become its own Northern Confederacy, it was supposed to merge with the British colonies of Quebec. And that was supposed to really be absorbed into a new British state, with the South also having their own British affiliations. So it was, again, a British plot, which again was attempted again in 1802. Or no, was it? Yeah, it was 1802, I think, when Byrd tried to run as the governor of New York, which was the engine of the economy, and he failed again entirely because of Hamilton. And even after he killed Hamilton, he tried a third time. So there's 3 attempts to break up the Union with this logic that the nation is too different because we have manufacturing and we have some states that are only agrarian, and thus we cannot coexist. And Hamilton is just saying right now that no, you absolutely can't exist because you do need each other. We are one nation. And so it's good to have that sort of drama in the mind as context for the words that we're reading right now to give it even more meat, you know?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thanks. So do you think that it's a combination of agrarian and manufacturing, and there's an issue of scale, so that if the confederations or the states or whatever you break up your nation into, if they have that within a radius of say 600 miles and they have all of that, that it's more manageable and more likely to be a cohesive, successful, prosperous entity?
Yeah, I mean, from my sense of it, I think Hamilton would probably agree that it is an organic, and we read, before we read Hamilton, we were reading Henry C. Carey, Lincoln's economic advisor, who was on the same idea as well, that it is in the organic creative evolution of the human species to not only diversify our fields of enterprise by the creation, every time you make a new discovery in the universe, that gives you all of a sudden a whole new field of new things you can do that you couldn't do when you were ignorant. So that means a whole new diversity of division of labor, of manufactories, but that also will, if it's permitted to organically grow without being disrupted, will also find synergy with the agricultural zones of production of raw materials, foods, and things. So you always have this this attraction, this rule of attraction of parts in a harmony of interests. Whereas like people who were thinking in the opposing school were of the view that no, there is an absolute opposition of interests that are always warring for their own selfish needs, you know? So yeah, from what you're saying, if it was left to itself, you would probably have a greater diversity within each state. And over time, you would find each state increasingly adopting manufacturing, science, tech, as well as a robust, healthy agricultural sector on the large and on the small. You know, you probably see a reflection of that in the local parts, but also onto the whole. It wouldn't just be like, oh, are you all about big production or little production? It would probably be more subtle than that dichotomy, you know? Yeah, Susie?
So it always comes down to the mindset and intent of open versus closed system. Is that correct?
That's probably the simplest way you could have said it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because I think from what I've learned from you that, you know, too many people have that mindset of a closed system and infinite resources, and I can't say the rest of it about diminishing returns. But if you have the mindset of an open system, added together, we are more than 2 + 2.
Well, the last sentence that I just read
Yeah.
sort of sums that up too. Mutual wants constitutes one of the strongest links of political connection, and the extent of these bears a natural proportion to the diversity in the means of mutual supply. It's a long-winded
I'd
way
have
of
to
saying
read
what
that
you've just
3
said.
times I'd have to read that 3 times to realize he said the same thing I did.
Yeah. I think you have to realize it, but read all of this 3 times.
But yeah, definitely. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. And that is due entirely to the metaphysical reality of us having a creative, soulful power as our essential character trait. And as, you know, such, you can't say that we are just a bunch of objects floating with urges to get gratification in a world of scarcity. That's not who we are. We could choose to try to act that way and see the natural effects, which is hell on earth, but that's not actually who we are, you know. It never works.
That's who we've been trained to become.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time and we need to get back to the reading, but how far have you traced that back? Where do they start with the idea of the closed system, and where do we find the open system trying to be explained? Is that all the way back to Plato too?
Oh,
Goes
before
back to
that.
Babylon.
Yeah, Babylon
Goes back
probably.
to Babylon.
Yeah, there's a really great paper by, I'll email it to you, Susan, by Lyndon LaRouche called, it really impressed me early on when I was trying to make sense of this stuff years ago. It was written in 1978 or 79, and it's called The Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elites. Bang up, wonderful paper. And it does take that broad, deep plunge into history from Babylon to the present with maybe 70 pages of just beautiful, clear analysis. I'll send it your way. It's pretty good.
Yeah, there are a number of good books. I would take too long to find the references that I'm thinking of now, but in one of Dr. Farrell's books, there's two writers talking about the history of money. If you go back to Babylon, for example, and you look at the history of the Jubilees, you know, where it was an open economy to begin with, where essentially all of the wealth was in the hands of the ruler. The prosperity of the nation was his responsibility, and I do mean the prosperity of everyone in the nation. Over time, you know, with various debts and things that happen, and they were often caused by seasonal problems. You know, we have a crop this year, it's not as good next year, I can't pay you what I owe you for borrowing money for the seed. Every 50 years, you used to have the breaking of the tablets, you know, where all of the private debt was just essentially eliminated. Things started to change, particularly when coins became the means of exchange. And the coins were, you know, you can trace the history of this too, because much of the science of that community was carried on in the, you know, within the priestly class, et cetera, et cetera. They were the one, think the money changers in the biblical example. They were the ones that first came up with the idea of, you know, using gold and silver to trade. And whether they instigated it initially or not, that led to the practice of usury. It led to the idea that the private creators of money were entitled to a rent on the product that they created, i.e. interest. And that's where things started to get problematic, and where the idea of creating a closed economy, one based on scarcity, was a means for manipulating that form of money. And that's, we've had that ever since, one way or another.
But I would still be careful, Paul, because there's a lack of, like, it's true, the abuse of the creation of coin and money and these things. Yeah, but the causal mechanism is always ideas. If you define human beings as being talking cattle to be controlled over by a master class, you'll always use whatever you can get at your disposal.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter what is available, you will use it to make people self-control.
It's not the money per se. It's the decision to use it a certain way, because it's in private hands.
Yeah.
You know, and the private hands start to realize they have an advantage. You know, they're no longer necessarily acting as the ruler was expected to do on behalf of the entire community. And it took, you know, a long time for that to develop into the oligarchs and the cabals that have been in operation for thousands of years. But yeah,
there's definitely something universal.
I don't want to say it begins there, of course, because we're talking about human nature. As Susan said before, our biggest problem is a moral problem. Well, that moral problem has been with us since human beings have been around.
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
But it's much more than just a moral problem. It's a lack of wisdom as well.
Yeah.
Because we got an awful lot of people that were working on being good people, but, you know,
yeah, far more than the obvious.
We needed to be harmless as doves, but wise as serpents. And we only read half the verse.
That's good. That's funny. I like that. That's good. Yep.
Okay, continuing on from where I just read that last sentence.
Yeah, do it.
Suggestions of an opposite complexion are ever to be deplored as unfriendly to the steady pursuit of one great common cause and to the perfect harmony of all the parts. In proportion as the mind is accustomed to trace the intimate connection of interest which subsists between all the parts of a society united under the same government, the infinite variety of channels which serve to circulate the prosperity of each to and through the rest, in that proportion, will it be little apt to be disturbed by solicitudes and apprehensions which originate in local discriminations. It is a truth as important as it is agreeable, and one to which it is not easy to imagine exceptions, that everything tending to establish substantial and permanent order in the affairs of a country, to increase the total mass of industry and opulence, is ultimately beneficial to every part of it. On the credit of this great truth, an acquiescence may safely be accorded from every quarter to all institutions and arrangements which promise a confirmation of public order and an augmentation of national resource. My only comment there is if only in the current world. But there are more particular considerations which serve to fortify the idea that the encouragement of manufactures is the interest of all parts of the Union. If the northern and middle states should be the principal scenes of such establishments, they would immediately benefit the more southern by creating a demand for productions, some of which they have in common with the other states, and others of which are either peculiar to them or more abundant or of better quality than elsewhere. These productions principally are timber, flax, hemp, cotton, wool, raw silk, indigo, iron, lead, furs, hides, skins, and coals. Of these articles, cotton and indigo are peculiar to the southern states, as are hitherto lead and coal. Flax and hemp are or may be raised in greater abundance there than in the more northern states. And the wool of Virginia is said to be of better quality than that of any other state, a circumstance rendered the more probable by the reflection that Virginia embraces the same latitudes with the finest wool countries of Europe. The climate of the South is also better adapted to the production of silk. The extensive cultivation of cotton can perhaps be expected, but from the previous establishment of domestic manufactories of the article, and the surest encouragement and vent for the others would result from similar establishments in respect to them. If then it satisfactorily appears that it is the interest of the United States generally to encourage manufactures, it merits particular attention that there are circumstances which render the present a critical moment for entering with zeal upon the important business. The effort cannot fail to be materially seconded by a considerable and increasing flux of money in consequence of foreign speculations in the funds and by the disorders which exist in different parts of Europe. Capital movements. The first circumstance not only facilitates the execution of manufacturing enterprises, but it indicates them as a necessary mean to turn the thing itself to advantage and to prevent its being eventually an evil. If useful employment be not found for the money of foreigners brought to the country to be invested in purchases of the public debt, it will quickly be re-exported to defray the expenses of an extraordinary consumption of foreign luxuries. And distressing drains of our specie may hereafter be experienced to pay the interest and redeem the principal of the purchased debt.
Okay, I just want to say something very quickly on this very important point, because you notice how just last page he made a point that or he said that increased production and abundance and opulence is always to be presumed to be a good. Now, if that's true, and that I agree with him in stating that, but a new problem then presents itself if you have a world where abundance and opulence becomes accessible to the many, then that also means more opportunities for corruption, right? And more decadence. Thus, then you have a problem with a population that is less and less capable of governing itself. If you're a decadent people, you care more about your hedonism and your consumption over what are you creating and what are you leaving behind, right? So this is where this great, he's sort of addressing this implicitly in this sentence or this paragraph that we just read, that if you have a situation where you have a productive society where the foreign investments are coming in and investing in the public debt. And of course, he's thinking about the national bank he's bringing online, because the national bank is the tool by which one useless dollar of debt can become $10 or more of investment capital towards the stimulation of new investments and new enterprises. So he's thinking about it in a very different way. But if you've got a society in motion where that money will be then used to make internal improvements, build canals, invest in manufacturing and other things, great, right? You're always putting it to work. Whereas if you're just a society which is not doing it, you're not building anything, you're just bringing in, even if you do get foreign investments and foreign money coming in, your population will increasingly just use it for luxury and not actually creation of anything, and become increasingly more dependent in time on the foreign powers that might be having the access to the wealth, the access to the money or other things.
Increasingly indebted.
Increasingly indebted over time, yeah.
Continuing, the first circumstance, you've got to go down, Matthew. The first circumstance not only facilitates the execution of manufacturing enterprises, but it indicates them as a necessary mean to turn the thing itself to advantage and to prevent its being eventually an evil. If useful employment be not found for the money of foreigners brought to the country to be invested in purchases of the public debt, it will quickly be re-exported to defray the expenses of an extraordinary consumption of foreign luxuries, just as you said, Matthew. And distressing drains of our specie may hereafter be experienced to pay the interest and redeem the principal of the purchased debt. This useful employment too ought to be of a nature to produce solid and permanent improvements. Infrastructure. If the money merely serves to give a temporary spring to foreign commerce, as it cannot procure new and lasting outlets for the products of the country, there will be no real or durable advantage gained. As far as it shall find its way in agricultural ameliorations, in opening canals, and in similar improvements, it will be productive of substantial utility. But there is reason to doubt whether in such channels it is likely to find sufficient employment, and still more whether many of those who possess it would be as readily attracted to objects of this nature as to manufacturing pursuits, which bear greater analogy to those to which they are accustomed and to the spirit generated by them. To open the one field as well as the other will at least secure a better prospect of useful employment for whatever accession of money there has been or may be. There is at the present juncture a certain fermentation of mind, a certain activity of speculation and enterprise, which if properly directed may be made subservient to useful purposes, but which if left entirely to itself may be attended with pernicious effects. The disturbed state of Europe, inclining its citizens to emigration, the requisite workmen will be more easily acquired than at any other time. And the effect of multiplying the opportunities of employment to those who emigrate may be an increase of the number and extent of valuable acquisitions to the population, arts, and industry of the country. To find pleasure in the calamities of other nations would be criminal, but to benefit ourselves by opening an asylum to those who suffer in consequence of them is as justifiable as it is politic. A full view having now been taken of the inducements to the promotion of manufactures in the United States, accompanied with an examination of the principal objections which are commonly urged in opposition, it is proper in the next place to consider the means by which it may be effected, as introductory to a specification of the objects which in the present state of things appear the most fit to be encouraged, and of the particular measures which it may be advisable to adopt in respect to each. In order to a better judgment of the means proper to be resorted to by the United States, it will be of use to avert to those which have been employed with success in other countries. The principal of these are, number one, protecting duties or duties on those foreign articles which are the rivals of the domestic ones intended to be encouraged.
And everybody knows what he means when he says duties on products.
Tariffs.
Yeah, protective tariffs, exactly.
Port charges, yeah, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I made the comment last time, I think, that during this time, of course, there was no such thing as income tax.
Oh, yeah, it was way before that. Yeah.
So it's all, you know, protective duties, tariffs, and all of those impositions essentially on manufacture, one way or another, or agriculture. That's where the government of the day gets its revenue. So very important aspect.
Mhm.
Continuing. Duties of this nature evidently amount to a virtual bounty on the domestic fabrics, since by enhancing the charges on foreign articles, they enable the national manufacturers to undersell all their foreign competitors. The propriety of this species of encouragement need not be dwelled upon, as it is not only a clear result from the numerous topics which have been suggested, but is sanctioned by the laws of the United States in a variety of instances. It has the additional recommendation of being a resource of revenue. Indeed, all the duties imposed on imported articles, though with an exclusive view to revenue, have the effect in contemplation, and except where they fall on raw materials, wear a beneficent aspect towards the manufacturers of the country. 2, prohibitions of rival articles or duties equivalent to prohibitions. This is another and an efficacious means of encouraging national manufactures. But in general, it is only fit to be employed when a manufacturer has made such a progress and is in so many hands as to ensure a due competition and an adequate supply on reasonable terms. Of duties equivalent to prohibitions, there are examples in the laws of the United States, and there are other cases to which the principle may be advantageously extended, but they are not numerous. Considering a monopoly of the domestic market to its own manufacturers as the reigning policy of manufacturing nations, a similar policy on the part of the United States in every proper instance is dictated. It might almost be said, by the principles of distributive justice, certainly by the duty of endeavouring to secure to their own citizens a reciprocity of advantages. 3, prohibitions of the exportation of the materials of manufactures. The desire of securing a cheap and plentiful supply for the national workman, and where the article is either peculiar to the country or of peculiar quality there, the jealousy of enabling foreign workmen to rival those of the nation with its own materials, are the leading motives to this species of regulation. It ought not to be affirmed that it is in no instance proper, but it is certainly one which ought to be adopted with great circumspection and only in very plain cases. It is seen at once that its immediate operation is to abridge the demand and keep down the price of the produce of some other branch of industry, generally speaking, of agriculture, to the prejudice of those who carry it on. And though if it be really essential to the prosperity of any very important national manufacture, it may happen that those who are injured in the first instance may be eventually indemnified by the superior steadiness of an extensive domestic market, depending on that prosperity. Yet in a matter in which there is so much room for nice and difficult combinations, in which such opposite considerations combat each other, prudence seems to dictate that the expedient in question ought to be indulged with a sparing hand. 4, pecuniary bounties. This has been found one of the most efficacious means of encouraging manufactures, and it is in some views the best. Though it has not yet been practiced upon by the government of the United States, unless the allowance on the exportation of dried and pickled fish and salted meat could be considered as a bounty, though it is less favoured by public opinion than some modes, its advantages are these.
And a bounty, it's really just like giving people a financial advantage to conducting business in a certain market. So you just make it like you can provide it as a tax credit, or it could be a direct actual subsidy from the government to do something you need as a society. So people want to do it a little bit more rather than something else.
Okay, its advantages are these. 1, it is a species of encouragement more positive and direct than any other, and for that reason has more immediate tendency to stimulate and uphold new enterprises, increasing the chances of profit and diminishing the risks of loss in the first attempt. 2, it avoids the inconvenience of a temporary augmentation of price, which is incident to some other modes, or it produces it to a less degree, either by making no addition to the charges on the rival foreign article, as in the case of protecting duties, or by making a smaller addition. The first happens when the fund for the bounty is derived from a different object, which may or may not increase the price of some other article according to the nature of that object. The second, when the fund is derived from the same or a similar object of foreign manufacture. 1% duty on the foreign article converted into a bounty on the domestic will have an equal effect with a duty of 2% exclusive of such bounty. And the price of the foreign commodity is liable to be raised in the one case in the proportion of 1%, in the other in that of 2%. Indeed, the bounty when drawn from another source is calculated to promote a reduction of price, because without laying any new charge on the foreign article, it serves to introduce a competition with it and to increase the total quantity of the article in the market. 3, bounties have not like high protecting duties a tendency to produce scarcity. An increase of price is not always the immediate, though where the progress of a domestic manufacture does not counteract a rise, it is commonly the ultimate effect of an additional duty. In the interval between the laying of the duty and a proportional increase of price, it may discourage importation by interfering with the profits to be expected from the sale of the article. 4, bounties are sometimes not only the best, but the only proper expedient for uniting the encouragement of a new object of agriculture with that of a new object of manufacture. It is the interest of the farmer to have the production of the raw material promoted by counteracting the interference of the foreign material of the same kind. It is the interest of the manufacturer to have the material abundant and cheap. If prior to the domestic production of the material in sufficient quantity, to supply the manufacturer on good terms, a duty be laid upon the importation of it from abroad with a view to promote the raising of it at home, the interests both of the farmer and manufacturer will be disserved by either destroying the requisite supply or raising the price of the article beyond what can be afforded to be given for it by the conductor of an infant manufacture. It is abandoned or fails, and there being no domestic manufacturers to create a demand for the raw material which is raised by the farmer, it is in vain that the competition of the like foreign article may have been destroyed. It cannot escape notice that a duty upon the importation of an article can no otherwise aid the domestic production of it than giving the latter greater advantages in the home market. It can have no influence upon the advantageous sale of the article produced in foreign markets, no tendency therefore to promote its exportation. The true way to conciliate these two interests is to lay a duty on foreign manufactures of the material, the growth of which is desired to be encouraged, and to apply the produce of that duty by way of bounty, either upon the production of the material itself or upon its manufacture at home, or both. It is this disposition of the thing the manufacturer commences his enterprise under every advantage which is attainable as to quantity or price of the raw material. And the farmer, if the bounty be immediately to him, is enabled by it to enter into a successful competition with the foreign material. If the bounty be to the manufacturer on so much of the domestic material as he consumes, the operation is nearly the same. He has a motive of interest to prefer the domestic commodity, if of equal quality, even at a higher price than the foreign, so long as the difference of price is anything short of the bounty which is allowed upon the article. Except the simple and ordinary kinds of household manufactures, or those for which there are very commanding local advantages, pecuniary bounties are in most cases indispensable to the introduction of a new branch. A stimulus and a support not less powerful and direct is, generally speaking, essential to the overcoming of the obstacles which arise from the competitions of superior skill and maturity elsewhere. Bounties are especially essential in regard to articles upon which those foreigners who have been accustomed to supply a country are in the practice of granting them. The continuance of bounties on manufactures long established must also always be of questionable policy, because a presumption would arise in every such case that there were natural and inherent impediments to success. But in new undertakings, they are as justifiable as they are oftentimes necessary. Excuse me. There is a degree of prejudice against bounties from an appearance of giving away the public money without an immediate consideration and from a supposition that they serve to enrich particular classes at the expense of the community. But neither of these sources of dislike will bear a serious examination. There is no purpose to which public money can be more beneficially applied than to the acquisition of a new and useful branch of industry. No consideration more valuable than a permanent addition to the general stock of productive labour. As to the second source of objection, it equally lies against other modes of encouragement which are admitted to be eligible. As often as a duty upon a foreign article makes an addition to its price, it causes an extra expense to the community for the benefit of the domestic manufacturer. A bounty does no more, but it is the interest of the society in each case to submit to a temporary expense, which is more than justifiable, no, compensated by an increase of industry and wealth, and by an augmentation of resources and independence, and by the circumstance of eventual cheapness, which has been noticed in another place. It would deserve attention, however, in the employment of this species of encouragement in the United States as a reason for moderating the degree of it in the instances in which it might be deemed eligible. That the great distance of this country from Europe imposes very heavy charges on all the fabrics which are bought from thence, amounting from 15 to 30% on their value, according to their bulk. That's a big percentage, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
A question has been made concerning the constitutional right of the government of the United States to apply this species of encouragement, but there is certainly no good foundation for such a question. The national legislature has express authority to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defence and general welfare, with no other qualifications than that all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States, that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to numbers ascertained by a census or enumeration taken on the principles prescribed in the Constitution, and that no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. These three qualifications accepted, the power to raise money is plenary and indefinite, and the objects to which it may be appropriated are no less comprehensive than the payment of the public debts and the providing for the common defence and general welfare. The terms general welfare were doubtless intended to signify more than was expressed or important in those which preceded. Otherwise, numerous exigencies incident to the affairs of a nation would have been left without a provision. The phrase is as comprehensive as any that could have been used. Because it was not fit that the constitutional authority of the Union to appropriate its revenues should have been restricted within narrower limits than the general welfare, and because this necessarily embraces a vast variety of particulars which are susceptible neither of specification nor of definition.
Yeah, I would say this is among the most important paragraphs of this entire essay that Hamilton has written. And it really does get to the crux of this whole pivot moment of world history around whether a nation is capable of constituting itself around a principle of the general welfare, which is the preamble of the US Constitution, and what liberty does that give the nation to do things? Because the general welfare is a very broad statement, right? And of course, it could be misused, as we see with the current situation of any tyrant would like to say what they do is for the welfare of the people. And so if the republic were ever permitted to become taken over by dishonest forces, they would definitely use such terms to justify all sorts of bad things. But does that make the principle of the general welfare the cause of the problem, or does it make the misuse of it the cause? And that's why many people today don't like Hamilton, because he pushed so heavily for this to be part of the framing of the Constitution itself, and especially its justification for national banking and the emission of, as Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution allows, the emission of credit, productive credit on behalf of the government for the welfare of the people, which many people who worship money and don't like this idea freak out about. So really, this paragraph is just golden. It's really good.
Yep. Yeah, the key definition that you used then, Matthew, was the use of the term productive credit.
Yeah, not Visa, not MasterCard credit.
Yeah. It is therefore of necessity left to the discretion of the national legislature to pronounce upon the objects which concern the general welfare and for which under that description an appropriation of money is requisite and proper. And there seems to be no room for a doubt that whatever concerns the general interests of learning, of agriculture, of manufactures and of commerce are within the sphere of the national councils as far as regards an application of money. The only qualification of the generality of the phrase in question, which seems to be admissible, is this, that the object to which an appropriation of money is to be made be general and not local. Its operation extending, in fact, or by possibility, throughout the Union and not being confined to a particular spot. No objection ought to arise to this construction from a supposition that it would imply a power to do whatever else should appear to Congress conducive to the general welfare. A power to appropriate money with this latitude, which is granted to in express terms, would not carry a power to do any other thing, not authorized in the Constitution, either expressly or by fair implication.
And this is one of the best points of condemnation of people who are trying to use this type of logic to justify things like the Green New Deal or the current, fake green Hamiltonian policies that they're trying to push through amongst some sectors of Davos-oriented crowds, which is that if you actually do things that involve banking and directed policies in a Hamiltonian form of government, you have to actually, you can't do whatever you want, especially if it hurts people. So right there, he's like, it still has to abide by the principles of the Constitution to uphold the welfare of the people. So if you try to do something which hurts the people, then it's not legitimate. It's not something you're allowed to do. Now, some people don't care about that fact, but they're also people who are more than happy to produce articles in National Geographic saying that maybe a limited nuclear war is good to stop global warming. That stuff is actually going out there, right? That was a real article that on Rogue News actually showed me today. I was bowled over.
Yeah. Saw that one.
Oh yeah.
Okay. 5, premiums. These are of a nature allied to bounties, though indistinguishable from them in some important features. Though distinguishable from them in some important features. Bounties are applicable to the whole quantity of an article produced or manufactured or exported and involve the corresponding expense. Premiums serve to reward some particular excellence or superiority, some extraordinary exertion or skill, and are dispensed only in a small number of cases. But their effect is to stimulate general effort. Contrived so as to be both honorary and lucrative, they address themselves to different passions, touching the chords as well of emulation as of interest. They are accordingly a very economical means of exciting the enterprise of a whole community. And whilst it's not an American example, growing up in Australia, and I'm sure you saw the same thing in Canada, a lot of products get a royal imprimatur.
What's that?
So, a certain jam is recommended and supplied, by supplying to the Queen or something like that. They get a premium, and therefore charge a higher price or something like that. But what the paragraph is saying, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it will mean the production and consumption of more and more of that stuff, or that's the idea behind it anyway, which benefits the community generally. Yeah.
If you're charging more for the product, though, I guess I don't fully understand the premium idea. How does that work? Because how would that benefit the producer if they're charging more for the product? Where's the premium coming in?
Well, more money circulating.
Oh.
Producing more of it, et cetera, and more money circulating, very simplistic idea, that one. But the premiums that I'm thinking of are really just, stamps on a product that say, as supplied to the Majesty or whatever, His Majesty.
Oh, that's how you're thinking. Because I'm a little bit confused about premium. I have a different idea. So you mean just the act of like an authority going in saying like, we support this product and giving it that extra push.
We use this product, and therefore, it's able to advertise itself, if you like, as a premium product. It's not necessarily better than the jam produced down the road by your local grandmother, but because the Queen uses it, it gets a
Oh, I
it
see.
gets a leg up in the market, if you like. And I think what he's saying there is that, premiums, I'm not saying that this is exactly the same kind of premium as Hamilton's talking about, but that if people don't understand what a premium is, I'm using the Royal example as a simple one, that as a result of that premium, they maybe get to charge a little bit more, maybe they don't, that's their choice, but they sell more, manufacture more, produce more, which has that corresponding multiplication effect throughout the economy, which everyone, in theory at least, benefits from.
Paul, quick question. Can you define, because I don't actually know, I feel a bit ignorant. I know premiums on my insurance policy, but how would you define a premium?
The example that I'm giving at the moment is probably merely an advertising premium.
Okay.
As supplied to Her Royal Highness. I just
You
remember
mean it's
seeing it on a lot of, foodstuffs and things like that, but not only foodstuffs, certain domestic products.
It's just an
Know what it-
endorsement, you mean?
Yeah, basically an endorsement. Yeah, thanks, David. That's a better idea.
Okay.
And as I said, I'm using it as an example.
Yeah. You're not saying
We're
it's,
not
it's
under-
necessarily exactly what he's saying. You're giving a general.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's not applicable to what Hamilton's talking about specifically. Anyway,
Mhm.
They are accordingly a very economical mean of exciting the enterprise of a whole community. There are various societies in different countries whose object is the dispensation of premiums for the encouragement of agriculture, arts, manufactures, and commerce. And though they are for the most part voluntary associations with comparatively slender funds, their utility has been immense. Much has been done by this mean in Great Britain. Scotland in particular owes materially to it, a prodigious amelioration of condition. From a similar establishment in the United States, supplied and supported by the government of the Union, vast benefits might reasonably be expected.
Yeah, I like the fact that sorry, was that?
No.
Oh, I was going to say, I really like the idea that he's bringing up the question of the arts as well, because people tend to think, again, they get sucked into this utilitarian idea of just producing, having more machinery. And it's like, no, in Hamilton's mind and in the mind of most of these types of statesmen like Benjamin Franklin or Colbert, they didn't differentiate the two-sided aspect of the arts, the sciences, and the applied sciences in the form of technological progress and the industrial effects of that. So the idea that he's saying that, if you have the cultivation of institutions of arts, of beauty creation, right, to give people who otherwise might not be able to find a medium to express and cultivate their skills as a musician or a painter or a dancer, give them those opportunities, right? Have a royal, like they have it in Britain or in Europe, you have Royal Institutes of Fine Arts and things like that. We'll have institutions like that are able to produce actually good quality art that could inspire good science as well, right? And you get a feedback, a really fun reciprocity that way.
Continuing, I'll read that last sentence. Some further ideas on this head shall accordingly be submitted in the conclusion of this report. 6, the exemption of the materials of manufactures from duty. The policy of that exemption as a general rule, particularly in reference to new establishments, is obvious. It can hardly ever be advisable to add the obstructions of fiscal burthens to the difficulties which naturally embarrass a new manufacture. And where it is matured and in condition to become an object of revenue, it is generally speaking better that the fabric than the material should be the subject of taxation. Ideas of proportion between the quantum of the tax and the value of the article can be more easily adjusted in the former than in the latter case. An argument for exemptions of this kind in the United States is to be derived from the practice, as far as their necessities are permitted, of those nations whom we are to meet as competitors in our own and in foreign markets. There are, however, exceptions to it, of which some examples will be given under the next head. The laws of the Union afford instances of the observance of the policy here recommended, but it will probably be found advisable to extend it to some other cases. Of a nature bearing some affinity to that policy is the regulation which exempts from duty the tools and implements, as well as the books, cloths, and household furniture of foreign artists who come to reside in the United States. an advantage already secured to them by the laws of the Union and which it is in every view proper to continue. Exactly what you're talking about there, Matthew. 7, drawbacks of the duties which are imposed on the materials of manufactures. It has already been observed as a general rule that duties on those materials ought, with certain exceptions, to be foreborne. Of these exceptions, 3 cases occur, which may serve as examples. 1, where the material is itself an object of general or extensive consumption and a fit and productive source of revenue. Another, where a manufacturer of a simpler kind, the competition of which with a like domestic article is desired to be restrained, partakes of the nature of a raw material from being capable, by a further process, to be converted into a manufacturer of a different kind, the introduction or growth of which is desired to be encouraged. A third, where the material itself is a production of the country and in sufficient abundance to furnish cheap and plentiful supply to the national manufacturer. Under the first description comes the article of molasses. It is not only a fair object of revenue, but being a sweet, it is just that the consumers of it should pay a duty as well as the consumers of sugar. Cottons and linens in their white state fall under the second description. A duty upon such as are imposed is proper to promote the domestic manufacture of similar articles in the same state. A drawback of that duty is proper to encourage the printing and staining at home of those which are brought from abroad. When the first of these manufactures has attained sufficient maturity in a country to furnish a full supply for the second, the utility of the drawback ceases. The article of hemp either now does or may be expected soon to exemplify the third case in the United States. Where duties on the materials of manufactures are not laid for the purpose of preventing a competition with some domestic production, the same reasons which recommend, as a general rule, the exemption of those materials from duties would recommend, as a like general rule, the allowance of drawbacks in favour of the manufacturer. Accordingly, such drawbacks are familiar in countries which systematically pursue the business of manufactures, which furnishes an argument for the observance of a similar policy in the United States. And the idea has been adopted by the laws of the Union in the instances of salt and molasses. It is believed that it will be found advantageous to extend it to some other articles. 8. The encouragement of new inventions and discoveries at home and of the introduction into the United States of such as may have been made in other countries, particularly those which relate to machinery.
Again, probably one of the most important sections of the essay.
Yeah, and especially at this time.
Yeah.
This is among the most useful and unexceptionable of the aids which can be given to manufacturers. The usual means of that encouragement are pecuniary rewards and, for a time, exclusive privileges. The first must be employed according to the occasion and the utility of the invention or discovery. For the last, so far as respects authors and inventors, provision has been made by law, but it is desirable in regard to improvements and secrets of extraordinary value to be able to extend the same benefit to introducers as well as authors and inventors, a policy which has been practiced with advantage in other countries. Here, however, as in some other cases, there is cause to regret that the competency of the authority of the national government to the good which might be done is not without a question. Many aids might be given to industry. Many internal improvements of primary magnitude might be promoted by an authority operating throughout the Union, which cannot be effected as well, if at all, by an authority confined within the limits of a single state. But if the legislature of the Union cannot do all the good that might be wished, it is at least desirable that all may be done which is practicable. Means for promoting the introduction of foreign improvements, though less efficaciously than might be accomplished with more adequate authority, will form a part of the plan intended to be submitted in the close of this report. It is customary with manufacturing nations to prohibit under severe penalties the exportation of implements and machines which they have either invented or improved. There are already objects for a similar regulation in the United States, and others may be expected to occur from time to time. The adoption of it seems to be dictated by the principle of reciprocity. Greater liberality in such respects might better comport with the general spirit of the country. But a selfish and exclusive policy in other quarters will not always permit the free indulgence of a spirit, which would place us upon an unequal footing. As far as prohibitions tend to prevent foreign competitors from deriving the benefit of the improvements made at home, they tend to increase the advantages of those by whom they may have been introduced and operate as an encouragement to exertion. 9. Judicious regulations for the inspection of manufactured commodities. This is not amongst the least important of the means by which the prosperity of manufactures may be promoted. It is indeed in many cases one of the most essential. Contributing to prevent frauds upon consumers at home and exporters to foreign countries, to improve the quality and preserve the character of the national manufactures, it cannot fail to aid the expeditious and advantageous sale of them, and to serve as a guard against successful competition from other quarters. The reputation of the flour and lumber of some states and of the potash of others has been established by an attention to this point, and the like good name might be procured for those articles, wheresoever produced, by a judicious and uniform system of inspection throughout the ports of the United States. I wish that colon wasn't there, never mind. A like system might also be extended with advantage to other commodities. 10. The facilitating of pecuniary remittances from place to place is a point of considerable moment to trade in general and to manufacturers in particular. Yeah, okay, I get it. That reads from 10, sorry. By rendering more easy the purchase of raw materials and provisions and the payment for manufactured supplies. A general circulation of bank paper, which is to be expected from the institution lately established, will be a most valuable means to this end. But much good would also accrue from some additional provisions respecting inland bills of exchange. If those drawn in one state payable in another were made negotiable everywhere, and interest and damages allowed in case of protest, it would greatly promote negotiations between the citizens of different states by rendering them more secure, and with it the convenience and advantage of the merchants and manufacturers of each. 11. The facilitating of the transportation of commodities. Ah, yes, another big one. Improvements favouring this object ultimately concern all the domestic interests of a community, but they may without impropriety be mentioned as having an important relation to manufactures. There is perhaps scarcely anything which has been better calculated to assist the manufactures of Great Britain than the ameliorations of the public roads of that kingdom, and the great project which has been of late made in opening canals. Of the former, the United States stands much in need, and for the latter, they present uncommon facilities. The symptoms of attention to the improvement of inland navigation, which have lately appeared in some quarters, must fill with pleasure every breast warmed with a true zeal for the prosperity of the country. These examples, it is to be hoped, will stimulate the exertions of the government and the citizens of every state. There can certainly be no object more worthy of the cares of the local administrations, and it were to be wished that there was no doubt of the power of the national government to lend its direct aid on a comprehensive plan. This is one of those improvements which could be prosecuted with more efficiency by the whole than by any part or parts of the Union. There are cases in which the general interest will be in danger to be sacrificed to the collision of some supposed local interests. Jealousies in matters of this kind are as apt to exist as they are apt to be erroneous. I'll just make a simple, another example here, which is a bit of a laughable one. In Australia, far more so than, let's say, in America, most of the national railways, whether it be at state level or that connect internationally, were done through national efforts and state efforts. In other words, they were publicly owned. The stupidity, exactly what he says there, jealousies in matters of this kind are as apt to exist as they are apt to be erroneous, because of the jealousies between the colonies, New South Wales and Victoria in particular, but to some degree Queensland and Brisbane as well. The massive rail networks in all of those three states were made using different gauges. So that if you wanted to take, going back prior to Federation, 1900, If you wanted to take productive goods via train, via rail from Victoria to New South Wales, you could do it. But when you got to the border of New South Wales, you had to take all of your productive goods or whatever from one train and stick them on another bloody train because the two colonies were operating at different gauges.
Yeah.
You know, so
It's amazing. Yeah. No, it's amazing the amount of self-mutilation that we do when we just think so. Well, but that's the thing, right? You always have this danger when you build something like a mega project, a large scale project that's going to traverse many states or provinces, whether in Australia or Canada or Europe or the US. It's going to cause a change in the local ways of doing things, right? People have made their money, their fortunes, they felt habituated and adapted to the way my dad did things, my grandpa did things. And there's a whole these little microeconomies, which along the way are going to be changed by the building of a canal or a rail system, which transforms the ultimate contours of the entire macro environment, right, that everybody's operating in. And certain people will, if they're not thinking about the welfare of the whole society that they're parts of, they will try to disturb or sabotage such projects in order to keep their way of doing things intact, which is why a lot of the Confederate Southern states that had been addicted to slave labor and a whole economy based on that all the way through the Civil War never wanted to have rail or industry that would contaminate their genteel way of just being, despite the fact that it was completely an offense on natural law and God's law. They didn't care. It was just like, that's disturbing of my way. So yeah, Hamilton was definitely dealing with this as well.
Yep. The following remarks are sufficiently judicious and pertinent to deserve a literal quotation. Good roads, canals, and navigable rivers, by diminishing the expense of carriage, put the remote parts of a country more nearly upon a level with those in the neighbourhood of the town. They are upon that account the greatest of all improvements. They encourage the cultivation of the remote, which must always be the most extensive circle of the country. They are advantageous to the town by breaking down the monopoly of the country in its neighbourhood. They are advantageous even to that part of the country. Though they introduce some rival commodities into the old market, they open many new markets to its produce. Monopoly, besides, is a great enemy to good management, which can never be universally established, but in consequence of that free and universal competition, which forces everybody to have recourse to it for the sake of self-defence. It is not more than 50 years ago that some of the countries in the neighbourhood of London petitioned the Parliament against the extension of the turnpike roads into the remoter counties. These remoter counties, they pretended, from the cheapness of labour, would be able to sell their grass, and corn cheaper in the London market than themselves, and they would thereby reduce their rents and ruin their cultivation. Their rents, however, have risen and their cultivation has been improved since that time. Specimens of a spirit similar to that which governed the countries here spoken of present themselves too frequently to the eye of an impartial observer and render it a wish of patriotism that the body in this country, in whose councils a local or partial spirit is least likely to predominate, were at liberty to pursue and promote the general interest in those instances in which there might be in danger of the interference of such a spirit. There might be danger of the interference of such a spirit. The foregoing are the principle of the means by which the growth of manufactures is ordinarily promoted. It is, however, not merely necessary that the measures of government which have direct view to manufactures should be calculated to assist and protect them, but that those which only collaterally affected them in the general course of the administration should be guarded from any peculiar tendency to injure them. There are certain species of taxes which are apt to be oppressive to different parts of the community, and among other ill effects have a very unfriendly aspect towards manufactures. All poll or capitation taxes are of this nature. They either proceed according to a fixed rate, which operates unequally and injuriously to the industrious poor, or they vest the discretion in certain officers to make estimates and assessments which are necessarily vague, conjectural, and liable to abuse. They ought therefore to be abstained from in all but cases of distressing emergency. I have to admit there, just having read that, I'm not sure what poll and capitation taxes are.
I don't know. Anybody right now know what a poll or capitation tax is?
I think it's a tax just generally on everybody, like
Yeah.
an equal amount,
That's
Yeah.
what
whether you're
poll tax
rich or
would be.
poor.
Yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense. Yep, that makes sense.
Oh, like
All
a head
such
tax.
tax-
You're right. Capitation, like decapitate, is to cut your head off. So a head
Yeah.
tax, right? And a
Yeah.
poll is like, yeah, let's get a survey to see how many people have an opinion. So yeah, it's like a general tax on like how many people live here. You're going to be taxed this
Yeah.
much, right?
Population.
Thank you, Kelly.
All such taxes, including all taxes on occupations, which proceed according to the amount of capital supposed to be employed in a business or of profits supposed to be made in it, are unavoidably hurtful to industry. It is in vain that the evil may be endeavoured to be mitigated by leaving it in the first instance in the option of the party to be taxed to declare the amount of his capital or profits. Men engaged in any trade of business have commonly weighty reasons to avoid disclosures, which would expose, with anything like accuracy, the real state of their affairs. They most frequently find it better to risk oppression than to avail themselves of so inconvenient a refuge. And the consequence is that they often suffer oppression. When the disclosure too, if made, is not definitive, but controllable by the discretion, or in other words, by the passions and prejudices of the revenue officers, it is not only an ineffectual protection, but the possibility of it being so is an additional reason for not resorting to it. Allowing to the public officers the most equitable dispositions, yet where they are to exercise a discretion without certain data, they cannot fail to be often misled by appearances. The quality of business which seems to be going on is, in a vast number of cases, a very deceitful criterion of the profits which are made. Yet it is perhaps the best they can have, and it is the one on which they will most naturally rely. A business, therefore, which may rather require aid from the government than be in a capacity to be contributory to it, may find itself crushed by the mistaken conjectures of the assessors of taxes. Arbitrary taxes, under which the denomination are comprised all those, under which denomination are comprised all those that leave the quantum of the tax to be raised on each person to the discretion of certain officers, are as contrary to the genius of liberty as to the maxims of industry. In this light, they have been viewed by the most judicious observers on government, who have bestowed upon them the severest epithets of reprobation, as constituting one of the worst features usually to be met within the practice of despotic governments. It is certain, at least, that such taxes are particularly inimical to the success of manufacturing industry and ought carefully to be avoided by a government which desires to promote it. The great copiousness of the subject of this report has insensibly led to a more lengthy preliminary discussion than was originally contemplated or intended. It appeared proper to investigate principles, to consider objections, and to endeavour to establish the utility of the thing proposed to be encouraged, previous to a specification of the objects which might occur as meriting or requiring encouragement, and of the measures which might be proper in respect to each. The first purpose having been fulfilled, it remains to pursue the second. In the selection of objects, 5 circumstances seem entitled to particular attention: the capacity of the country to furnish the raw material, the degree to which the nature of the manufacture admits of a substitute for manual labour and machinery, the facility of execution, the extensiveness of the uses to which the article can be applied, its subserviency to other interests, particularly the great one of national defence. There are, however, objects to which these circumstances are little applicable, for which some special reasons may have a claim to encouragement. A designation of the principal raw material of which each manufacture is composed will serve to introduce the remarks upon it, as in the first place, iron.
So here we are. It is now almost 10 o'clock Eastern time. I scanned through this before we began, and I noted, Pascal and I have read through this in the past, and I'd forgotten that, but it's true. I never actually read each of the following, 20 pages. 46, 56, or 15 pages or so. What he's doing now is he's breaking down in the world that he lives in, the different most strategic items, raw materials and other things to be developed by the early USA. Now, a lot of this, he's going to go through iron. He's going to say a word about iron. He's then going to, after saying a word about iron and the conditions upon which it needs to be developed, he's then going to develop its uses. And I think we should read the thing on iron, but then he's going to go into copper. And then he's going to say a few things about that, and then lead, and then fossil coal for energy, and wood, skins. What else? Grain. So certain just strategic commodities. And again, a lot of it is very applicable specifically to the world that he lives in and how to increase its bounty, its production. I'm not sure we should read necessarily each one of these elements, but what do you think, Pascal? Do you think we should read each one, or do you think that we should maybe just read iron and then move to the end, which is my impulse, but I don't know.
Yeah, for tonight, I don't know. It's starting to be late, you're right.
If you're going to do it tonight, it makes sense to read one of them.
Yeah, because I'm thinking if we end this paper tonight, it is very late. We might want to just read iron, get a flavor for how he's thinking about these commodities, move to the last page, read the last page or 2 pages maybe, where he sort of closes up his idea. And then we can say that we've read the essentials of the report on manufacturers. That's my impulse. Because it's going to be weird next week jumping into just a whole bunch of lists of commodities. You know?
Yeah, we need to spend half an hour doing a preamble.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go for it.
Okay, so iron,
we'll read
iron in the last
iron,
couple of pages. Yeah, all right.
and then we'll
sure.
scan through each of the titles of the commodities. Then we'll read the last concluding remarks.
Yeah, okay. Iron. The manufacturers of this article are entitled to preeminent rank. None are more essential in their kinds, nor so extensive in their uses. They constitute in whole or in part the implements or the materials or both of almost every useful occupation. Their instrumentality is everywhere conspicuous. It is fortunate for the United States that they have peculiar advantages for deriving the full benefit of this most valuable material. And they have every motive to improve it with systematic care. It is to be found in various parts of the United States in great abundance and of almost every quality. And fuel, the chief instrument in manufacturing it, is both plenty and cheap and plenty. This particular applies to charcoal, but there are productive coal mines already in operation and strong indications that the material is to be found in abundance in a variety of other places. The inquiries to which the subject of this report has led have been answered with proofs that manufactories of iron, though generally understood to be extensive, are far more so than is commonly supposed. The kinds in which the greatest progress has been made have been mentioned in another place and need not be repeated. But there is little doubt that every other kind, with due cultivation, will rapidly succeed. It is worthy of remark that several of the peculiar trades of which it is the basis are capable of being carried on without the aid of large capitals. Iron works have very greatly increased in the United States and are prosecuted with much more advantage than formerly. The average price before the revolution was about $64 per tonne. At present it is about 80, a rise which is chiefly to be attributed to the increase of manufactures of the material. It's in demand. The still further extension and multiplication of such manufacturers will have the double effect of promoting the extraction of the metal itself and of converting it to a greater number of profitable purposes. Those manufacturers, too, unite in a greater degree than almost any others the several requisites which have been mentioned as proper to be consulted in the selection of objects. The only further encouragement of manufactories of this article, the propriety of which may be considered as unquestionable, seems to be an increase of the duties on foreign rival commodities. Steel is a branch which has already made a considerable progress, and it is ascertained that some new enterprises on a more extensive scale have been lately set on foot. The facility of carrying it to an extent which will supply all internal demands and furnish a considerable surplus for exportation cannot be doubted. The duty upon the importation of this article, which is at present 75 cents per cent.
That's a bit weird, eh?
Yeah, may it is conceived, be safely and advantageously extended to.
Yeah, sorry.
Let me just read that again. The duty upon the importation of this article, which is at present 75 cents per cent, may, it is conceived, be safely and advantageously extended to 100 cents. Sometimes in this, we've talked about this before, Matthew, but the way it's written, I mean, you know, I would want a couple of commas there to make it easy to read.
Yeah,
the way
I agree with
just
you.
did.
Yeah. No, you're doing an admirable job. You're.
Where sometimes there are too bloody many commas and colons. Never mind.
Yeah.
It is desirable by decisive arrangements to second the effects which are making it so very valuable a branch. The United States already, in a great measure, supply themselves with nails and spikes. They are able and ought certainly to do it entirely. The first and most laborious operation in this manufacture is performed by water mills, and of the persons afterwards employed, a great proportion of boys, whose early habits of industry are of importance to the community, to the present support of their families, and to their own future comfort. It is not less curious than true that in certain parts of the country, the making of nails is an occasional family manufacture. The expediency of an additional duty on these articles is indicated by an important fact. About 1,800,000 pounds of them were imported to the United States in the course of the year ending 30th of September, 1790. A duty of 2 cents per pound would, it is presumable, speedily put an end to so considerable an importation, and it is in every view proper that an end should be put to it. The manufacture of these articles, like that of some others, suffers from the carelessness and dishonesty of a part of those who carry it on. An inspection in certain cases might tend to correct the evil. It will deserve consideration whether a regulation of this sort cannot be applied without inconvenience to the exportation of the articles either to foreign countries or from one state to another. The implements of husbandry are made in several states in great abundance. In many cases, many places, it is done by the common blacksmiths, and there is no doubt that an ample supply for the whole country can, with great ease, be procured among ourselves. Various kinds of edged tools for the use of mechanics are also made, and a variable quantity of hollow wares, although the business of castings has not yet attained the perfection which might be wished. It is, however, improving, as there are respectable capitals in good hands embarked in the prosecution of those branches of iron manufactories which are yet in their infancy, and they may all be contemplated as objects not difficult to be acquired. To ensure the end, it seems equally safe and prudent to extend the duty ad valorem upon all manufactures of iron, or of which iron is the article of chief value, to 10%. Firearms and other military weapons may, it is conceived, be placed without inconvenience in the class of articles rated at 15%. There are already manufactories of those articles which only require the stimulus of a certain demand to render them inadequate to the supply of the United States. Adequate to the supply of the United States. It would also be a material aid to manufactories of this nature, as well as a mean of public security, if provision should be made for an annual purchase of military weapons of home manufacturer to a certain determinate extent, in order to the formation of arsenals, and to replace from time to time such as should be withdrawn for use, so as always to have in store the quantity of each, which should be deemed a competent supply. But it may hereafter deserve legislative consideration whether manufactories of all the necessary weapons of war ought not to be established on account of the government itself. Such establishments are agreeable to the usual practice of nations, and that practice seems founded on sufficient reason. There seems to be an improvidence in leaving these essential instruments of national defence to the casual speculations of individual adventure, a resource which can less be relied on in this case than in most others, the articles in question not being objects of ordinary and indispensable private consumption or use, As a general rule, manufactories on the immediate account of government are to be avoided, but this seems to be one of the few exceptions which that rule admits, depending on very special reasons. The premature of defence. Manufacturers of steel generally, or of which steel is the article of chief value, may with advantage be placed in the class of goods rated at 7.5%. As manufacturers of this kind have not yet made any considerable progress, it is a reason for not rating them as high as those of iron. But as this material is the basis of them, and as their extension is not less practicable than important, it is desirable to promote it by a somewhat higher duty than the present. A question arises how far it might be expedient to permit the importation of iron in pigs and bars freely from duty. I love that word. I'd love to know where the term pig iron comes from. Never mind. It would certainly be favourable to manufacturers of the article, but the doubt is whether it might not interfere with its production. Two circumstances, however, abate if they do not remove apprehension on this score. One is the considerable increase of price, which is already, which has been already remarked, and which renders it probable that the free admission of foreign iron would not be inconsistent with an adequate profit to the proprietors of ironworks. The other is the augmentation of demand, which would be likely to attend the increase of manufactures of the article in consequence of the additional encouragements proposed to be given, but caution nevertheless in a matter of this kind is most advisable. The measure suggested ought perhaps rather to be contemplated subject to the lights of further experience than immediately adopted.
Okay. All right. So that was specifically iron. Now that was the longest one, and for copper, for lead, it'll be shorter considerations. But again, he's making really these are heated battles, and they're largely specific to the particulars of the world that he's operating within. He'll do the same thing for lead, as I said, for coal, for wood, skins, leathers, grain. Let's see what else he's got here. He talks a lot about grain. Actually, quite a bit about grain. Flax and hemp, and various purposes of flax and hemp, and how to stimulate them, specifically cotton. This is probably a pretty useful one because he's going to be thinking about how to make the argument that the cotton dependent nations of the South could also have manufacturing, but also, that's probably in the back of his mind. So I would suggest that this is going to be like sort of a homework or people's personal time reading through these sections, taking note and just thinking about everything that he said before that. Wool is going to be a section, silk is a section, glass, gunpowder, paper, printed books, probably important, refined sugars and chocolate, very important. And here we are. That's the end of the specifics. Now we're at page 61 of 63. I would say here we could round it out. So where does he end? Refined sugars, cocoa. Here, I think this is probably the good place to kick in. And then within like the next 10, 15 minutes, we should be finished. So is that okay?
Sure.
All right.
There would appear to be a propriety in encouraging the manufacturer by a somewhat higher duty on its foreign rival than is paid on the raw material. I think he's still talking about cotton or cocoa. 2 cents per pound on imported chocolate wood, it is presumed to be without inconvenience. The foregoing heads comprise the most important of the several kinds of manufactures which have occurred as requiring, and at the same time as most proper for public encouragement, and such measures for affording it as have appeared best calculated to answer the end have been suggested. The observations which have accompanied this delineation of objects supersede the necessity of many supplementary remarks. One or two, however, may not be altogether superfluous. Bounties are in various instances proposed as one species of encouragement. It is a familiar objection to them that they are difficult to be managed and liable to frauds, but neither that difficulty nor this danger seem sufficiently great to countervail the advantages of which they are productive when rightly applied. And it is presumed to have been shown that they are in some cases, particularly in the infancy of new enterprises, indispensable. It will, however, be necessary to guard with extraordinary circumspection the manner of dispensing them. The requisite precautions have been thought of, but to enter into the detail would swell this report, already voluminous, to a size too inconvenient. Hear, hear. If the principle shall not be deemed inadmissible, the means of avoiding an abuse of it will not be likely to represent insurmountable obstacles. There are useful guides from practice in other quarters. It shall therefore only be remarked here in relation to this point that any bounty which may be applied to the manufacture of an article cannot with safety extend beyond those manufactories at which the making of the article is a regular trade. It would be impossible to annex adequate precautions to a benefit of that nature if extended to every private family in which the manufacture was incidentally carried on, and its being a merely incidental occupation which engages a portion of that time would otherwise be lost. It can be advantageously carried on without so special an aid. The possibility of a diminution of the revenue may also present itself as an objection to the arrangements which have been submitted. But there is no truth which may be more firmly relied upon than that the interests of the revenue are promoted by whatever promotes an increase of national industry and wealth. In proportion to the degree of these is the capacity of every country to contribute to the public treasury, and where the capacity to pay is increased or even is not decreased, the only consequence of measures which diminish any particular resource is a change of the object. If by encouraging the manufacture of an article at home, the revenue which has been wont to accrue from its importation should be lessened, an indemnification can easily be found either out of the manufacture itself or from some other object which may be deemed more convenient. Product substitution. The measures, however, which have been submitted, taken aggregately, will for a long time to come rather augment than decrease the public revenue. There is little room to hope that the progress of manufactures will so equally keep pace with the progress of population as to prevent even a gradual augmentation of the product of the duties on imported articles. As nevertheless, an abolition in some instances and a reduction in others of duties which have been pledged for the public debt is proposed, it is essential that it should be accompanied with a competent substitute. In order to this, it is requisite that all the additional duties which shall be laid be appropriated in the first instance to replace all defalcations which may proceed from any such abolition or diminution. It is evident at first glance that they will not only be adequate to this, but will yield a considerable surplus. This surplus will serve, first, to constitute a fund for paying the bounties which shall have been decreed. Secondly, to constitute a fund for the operations of a board to be established for promoting arts. I love it, the fact that that's number one there, Matthew. Agriculture, manufactures, and commerce. Of this institution, different intimations have been given in the course of this report. An outline of a plan for it shall now be submitted. Let a certain annual sum be set aside and placed under the management of commissioners, not less than 3, to consist of certain officers of the government and their successors in office. Let these commissioners be empowered to apply the fund confided to them to defray the expenses of the emigration of artists and manufacturers in particular branches of extraordinary importance, to induce the prosecution and introduction of useful discoveries, inventions, and improvements by proportionate rewards, judiciously held out and applied, to encourage by premiums, both honourable and lucrative, the exertions of individuals and of classes in relation to the several objects they are charged with promoting, and to afford such other aids to those objects as may be generally designated by law. The commissioners to render to the legislature an annual account of their transactions and disbursements, and all such sums as shall not have been applied to the purposes of their trust at the end of every 3 years to revert to the Treasury. It may also be enjoined upon them not to draw out the money, but for the purpose of some specific disbursement. It may moreover be of use to authorise them to receive voluntary contributions, making it their duty to apply them to the particular objects for which they may have been made, if any shall have been designated by the donors. There is reason to believe that the progress of particular manufactures has been much retarded by the want of skillful workmen, And it often happens that the capitals employed are not equal to the purposes of bringing from abroad workmen of a superior kind. Here, in cases worthy of it, the auxiliary agency of government would in all probability be useful. There are also valuable workmen in every branch who are prevented from emigrating solely by the want of means. Occasional aid to such persons properly administered might be a source of valuable acquisitions to the country. Immigration, yes. Stimulating by rewards, the invention and introduction of useful improvements. Sorry, I'll start again. The propriety of stimulating by rewards, the invention and introduction of useful improvements is admitted without difficulty, but the success of attempts in this way must evidently depend much on the manner of conducting them. It is probable that the placing of the dispensation of those rewards under some proper discretionary direction, where they may be accompanied by collateral expedients, will serve to give them the surest efficacy. It seems impracticable to apportion, by general rules, specific compensations for discoveries of unknown and disproportionate utility. The great use which may be made of a fund of this nature to procure and import foreign improvements is particularly obvious. Among those, the article of machines would form a most important item. The operation and utility of premiums have been averted to, together with the advantages which have resulted from their dispensation under the direction of certain public and private societies. Of this, some experience has been had in the instance of the Pennsylvania Society for the promotion of manufactures and useful arts, but the funds of that association have been too contracted to produce more than a very small portion of the good to which the principles of it would have led. It may confidently be affirmed that there is scarcely anything which has been devised better calculated to excite a general spirit of improvement than the institutions of this nature. They are truly invaluable. In countries where there is great private wealth, much may be affected by the voluntary contributions of patriotic individuals. Philanthropy. But in a community situated like that of the United States, the public purse must supply the deficiency of private resource. In what can it be so useful as in prompting and improving the efforts of industry? Oh, that was an effort.
It's good. It's good. We did it. We did it. Yeah. You know, and reading and listening to you read this, it's sort of painful, right? Because you look at how we all know that the oligarchy is incapable of themselves creating anything really new, but they can react and they could try to take control and subvert things that are created by actual good creative people. And so you sort of see, and me just having, I was thinking a little bit about how Canada, which is where I live, has been, we found a bastardization and a perversion of these mechanisms that were innovated by Hamilton, used for destructive ends. Like in the case of Canada's artistic world, it was completely shaped by this, you could say on the surface, Hamiltonian innovation in the 1950s around the Canada Council for the Arts and Humanities, which was essentially just that, to take the revenue of the state, have a certain, limited body of overseers that would then distribute the wealth accrued by duties and other things, taxes, what have you, for the cultivation of a certain type of artistic culture, so that grants were given to certain artists that were producing really modernist, abstract, atonal crap art, right? Because that's the sort of thing that they wanted. So they would pour money into and giving grants to those people, but people who were actually producing real beautiful things would not get any of that. They wanted to crush that. So you have this sort of, you could see how this could be direct, the artistic world as well, and its trickle down effect towards the scientific world could be used towards destructive ends, but you could also see how inversely this could be such a good and powerful thing, like an instrument to do such amazingly good things, if you actually have wise people who care about beauty and goodness governing, the policy.
That whole arts thing. I mean, I don't know whether you caught the email that I sent you after, I think it was Jeremy who presented on Australia.
I read that, yeah.
Okay, well, you know, my main point, and I'll emphasize it even more in singling out Gough Whitlam, the changes that became, you know, such a part of the social fabric of Australia during my lifetime. You know, I mean, I was born in 52, so Whitlam elected in 72. I was 20 years of age. One of the areas that became most noticeable for everyone was the way in which all of a sudden Australian arts flourished. They provided, I mean, the government literally provided, I don't know whether you want to call it a bounty or a premium or whatever, on investment in films. There was a 50% depreciation allowance on Australian films. And there was a whole swathe of really, really good Australian films, Gallipoli, quite a number of others. I can't remember all of them, but many of them that went on to have, you know, I mean, what's his name?
Crocodile Dundee.
Yeah, Crocodile Dundee. I'm sorry, my memory is
Sorry, that was my.
yeah, but plenty of
Ignorant
others.
question.
You know, in music, there were an awful lot of bands that became very, very popular nationally. I'm thinking of bands like Midnight Oil, who just played their last concert. Various bands that succeeded overseas, Little River Band, In Excess, a whole bunch of others that lifted the whole music scene in Australia. Then there were a number of writers that achieved prominence as writers. Clive, I wish I could remember his name. He went to Britain and had a TV show for a long time. Clive, I just can't think of his name, but he was part of what was called the Sydney Push, grew out of New South Wales University of Sydney. There was enormous public knowledge in relation to all of this. It was on the TV. It was cheap and easy to go and see plays and to watch comedies and goodness knows all sorts of things. The arts became, I don't want to say in your face, but more prominent than they had been in the 23 prior years under Liberal government. I mean, okay, the country was recovering from the Second World War, so there's some, you know, reason for that. But the explosion of that, and much of it as a result of, you know, government investment, et cetera, just gave way to an enormous confidence within the community that anybody could do anything. You know, that success was possible for so many people that had been excluded from even thinking that sort of thing. You know, working class families like mine, when we grew up, you know, I'm in university, Jesus, we were never going to contemplate that until all of a sudden it became free education in the 70s. And I went on and my mother went on and my sister went on to graduate from university, etc. As I commented when I was reading it, when Hamilton put the word arts at the start of one of those sentences, and as you said to Matthew, that the most important aspect here is the development of culture, because culture leads to so many other things. It leads to confidence, it leads to education, it leads to the spread of knowledge, and dare I say it, to some degree at least, when it's done well and when it's appreciated properly, it leads to acceptance, to tolerance, to diversity.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's super important. Yeah.
Yes, it's been an interesting discussion.
The fact that Hamilton just was able to recognize, and largely, I mean, this is more, I guess, more common in Hamilton's age, with Benjamin Franklin being such a force of history, having been somebody who lived and worked with Hamilton and shaped so much of American culture. You know, the idea of the arts, the creative impulse that allows for the overcoming of the limits to growth, and its relationship to inventions, discoveries, the increasing powers of productivity that allows for the liberty of a people. This was much more understood as different sides of the exact same thing. Whereas today, each thing gets sort of like, you know, I went to university and they had in one building, it was divided right down the middle between the engineering departments and the fine arts departments. And there was no wall separating them, but there would never be, I was a fine arts student, you would never have any crossover at all. It was like two different universes coexisting in one building. And the engineers did not think they didn't allow the pollution of their feelings. They were taught that that's anti-science, anti-logic, and the artists were taught not to allow their reason to pollute their pure feelings. And you just had this weird, you know, microcosm of the problems of our times in our world, right? Nobody could see that they're supposed to be different sides of the same thing.
Which shows you how quickly things can change.
Fragmentation.
Hyper-fragmentation, yeah, hyper.
And the
My first degree at university.
compartmentalization.
Sorry, Susan.
I'm sorry, I missed what you were saying.
No. I was just going to make a comment on what Matthew just said about his university experience, because mine's a little bit earlier, I'm sure, and was slightly different. My first degree was begun in 1971, and it was kind of the opposite in the sense that anybody doing a science degree had to do one art subject.
That's cool.
Anybody doing an arts degree had to do a science subject. So there was kind of a crossover, and it wasn't, you know, the engineers didn't take it terribly seriously. They picked some pissy history subject or whatever that they knew they could pass by copying cheat sheets and everything like that. They just had to do it. Mm-hmm. But it was on the tail end, if you like, of a university education that was not geared to employment. It was geared to producing a higher mindset. And I think, you know, what Hamilton is suggesting and what you're suggesting, what I'm suggesting is that so much of what is the wealth of creativity within a community is going to be improved enormously through the arts. And often in ways that are intangible and almost unknowable. I mean, the simple one of, you know, making the whole community literate so that people can read, that's a very obvious one. But you know, participation in visual arts, in oral arts, in all of those sorts of things does have tangible and intangible effects that contribute very strongly to the potential creative output of a community.
Amen to that.
And it's been fascinating because throughout the whole of this reading and everything, one of the things that I found is that so many of the ideas, the economic ideas that are being talked about, remind me of the crap that I was taught in economics. You know, it was all Adam Smith and all of that sort of stuff on the tail end of, but you know, we were, you know, under the Keynesian thing back then, but you know, so many of the laws of comparative advantage, all of this sort of stuff, you know, blah, 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 blah. To find such an emphasis, even though it was minimal, it wasn't like every paragraph we're reading this, but at crucial times in that article, he puts the preeminence of the arts, or suggests that the government should be involved in supporting this area of the economy as well, not just the mundane manufacturing or agricultural products. I find that intriguing. You know, I mean, I wouldn't have expected it, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you tend to, I was thinking about this a little bit because I was having a conversation this morning with a woman from Oshawa in Ontario, and she's running, you know, she's a member of the PPC. She's run as a candidate for office, and she has a podcast. So she was talking to me, and in her mind, it was a slightly overly simplistic breakdown of what the mechanism. She didn't have a sense of the British Empire. She didn't really have a strong sense of what is the oligarchy or what is the American. She didn't know about any of that. So in her mind, the nemesis of all humanity is this overly simplistic idea of just communism. It's the communist conspiracy that's out to just destroy the world. And it's like, well, no. And I tried to do my best to, and I think I did an okay job, but I'm not sure. To get across that, look, this evil pre-exists Marx and Engels. Like before there was communism, there was this evil, you know. There was the thing that I was trying to get her to appreciate, that there is two types of, like in the 20th century, you'll find generally two types of people who identify as being communist, socialist, and two types of people who identify as being capitalist. You've got the Fabian Society socialist communists, right, who use the veneer in order to create a scientific dictatorship and weaponize, you know, they want to weaponize abused people to become their tools to advance their real control. They don't really care about the people. They're all anti-humanist anyway. But then you also have people like Paul Robeson. You've got a lot of other people throughout history, you know, Allende from Chile and others who were, they didn't know of anything, but they only knew of communism, but they fought and gave their lives for an idea of justice and, you know, giving human beings the ability to have access to their full potentials. So it's not like they weren't obedient to every element of what Marx was saying, but they saw that labor was not simply a physical thing, but labor was also a mental thing. So that creativity in their minds was also a function of labor. You couldn't just say it's just this utilitarian produce thing. And it's like, so you have the feudal communists, and then you've got genuine people who care and call themselves communists. And then you have the feudal capitalists who act like they're pro-capitalism, but in reality, they're like George Soros. They just want to enslave everybody and they don't care about capitalism. And then you have actual people who want to create capital and who see that the purpose of what causes capital is creativity. Like Hamilton says, it's in the creation and the multiplication of the fields of enterprise that gives the mind of people the stimulation to make discoveries. That's what gives value to the money and everything else. So you got these, it's more subtle, you know, than the communist versus capitalist hyper simplified narrative tries to portray it, and it really makes people lobotomized and brain dead.
It's
when they're
almost like
looking at
a,
it.
it's almost like a fake left.
It's a fake
uh,
left, yeah.
It's an authoritarianism. And also when you look at these, so many of these countries that say communism and socialism, they didn't really implement much for the people. I mean, even if you look at China, did they have worker ownership of the businesses? I mean, the state just kind of took over everything. I guess it's kind of like anyone can say the word freedom and use it as for authority, you know, to authoritarian takeover or whatever. Not that I'm saying communism or socialism is freedom, but just as another example, anyone can, yeah.
Well, that's what the sort of the Fabian society socialism is it will say like we need workers' rights and pro-labor, but just to attract the unions and to attract the poor people, but then they're more than happy to throw them away like garbage once they've overthrown the government that they want to destabilize using the weaponized masses, you know, versus actual people who really do care about people, you know, and they will use mechanisms. And this is why a lot of people even call Hamilton a communist, because he's talking about using central government planning. He's talking about thinking about, you know, national credit, directing, like having a policy influence over arts and science. Like that, you would say would be, I mean, this is a long time before Marx was even born. And people would, you know, simplistically say, oh, that's communism. So yeah, well, George Washington agreed with this. Does that mean that Washington's a communist? Is the American Revolution a communist revolution? No, it wasn't that simplistic. They just believed that social values and moral principles should govern and thought should govern the behavior of a nation and its future. It wasn't, you know, this whole idea of communism versus like simplified idiotic monetary capitalism made people super, super dumb.
Yeah, only two choices.
Yeah,
Not
no,
a lot of nuance.
a lot of nuance.
Way more nuanced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
a
you
part of it,
said you hate that word nuance, but it really is important
It's an
because
important word. Yeah, it gets abused, but it's an important word.
we have all been lied to for so long and dumbed down for so long that just to go ahead and peel back the layers and look at all of these ideas and have these discussions, it really lets your mind grow and expand. And that really is the most important issue, is letting our minds grow and expand so that we can do our part in the next stage of this mess.
Well said.
Hmm.
Well said.
yeah.
And you know, and
Paul, I really enjoyed your reading. You do an excellent job.
Got a little bit hard towards the end there because, you know, I'm 70 in a month or just under a month now, and the eyes started to get a bit of strain.
no, you did great, Paul. We wouldn't have gotten.
I'm glad you
If it
appreciate
wasn't for your reading, we would not have gotten through this today. It would have been another extra 2-hour reading ahead of us.
It's fun and it's challenging, as I say. I'm trying to read, you know, with the nuance, you know, eyes looking a little bit ahead as we all do, and to get the intent of a sentence. But along the way, you catch this little comma. Oh,
Yeah.
I've got to pause because there's a comma. And as often as not, the commas are in the wrong place or useless.
Well, you're looking for the idea.
That's the website, because I was reading from the compiled work of Hamilton,
Yeah.
and the commas are there, but on the website that I found, yeah,
Yeah.
it's supposedly the founders' websites, and
Bastards.
Well, it's challenging, but it's fun, you know, trying to read a sentence and give the intended meaning, you know, and to keep going and to thread it all together. I mean, a couple of times you stumble and everything like that, but I find it fun to do.
Yeah. Well, I remember LaRouche had written a really wonderful paper. I haven't decided what we'll read next week, but I do want to read a thorough paper by LaRouche. But there's one thing that's touching on this conversation that is meaningful, which was, I think it's called History as Classical Tragedy. And what you're getting at regarding I mean, it's a very simple thing, right? Like your mindset going into this paper was to try to, I saw it very clearly. You're trying to tap into Hamilton's thought, his idea, what is his intention, which is guiding your decision when to emphasize something or how to like use your rhythm. I can see that very clearly. Some people tend to read overly like the words and they lose sight of the intention. And when you're like learning drama, that's always what you're doing, right? You're like, I'm gonna have to play a person who I am not, and I'm gonna read the script or the dramatic text, and I'm gonna have to try to put myself in their shoes to determine how am I gonna read their lines, right? And when you have a healthy, I think, education process, drama is gonna be, it will play a very important role in the high school or even earlier, primary school education process of a young person, so that they can get out of their ego, learn how to think in somebody else's mindset, and yet not lose themselves at the same time. And in history, when you actually start realizing that history is drama, it's like shaped, like Shakespeare said, right? All the world's a stage and we're all actors, where none of us is just an objective voyeur observing something that we're not a part of. And the question then is the free will thing. Do we participate in it? And if we do we participate with wisdom or not in that drama? And when you think about it that way, you start seeing that there are these beautiful and often tragic stories when you're like zeroing in on otherwise dry lessons of history, whether it is the world that Hamilton lived in, his fight, like look at his fight to subvert Burr and stop the breakup of the Union under these amazing conspiracies that he was intervening on to stop, right? And then him getting killed 2 years after his son was killed at the same spot by one of Aaron Burr's lackeys, with the same guns that were ultimately used to kill Hamilton, which was, done by Burr, who then went on to try for a third time to create another Western conspiracy with another, British agent who was the governor of the Louisiana territories. And it was subverted, somebody blew the whistle, like a Smedley Butler type who was part of their grouping, and went to the Congress to say that, look, this conspiracy is happening. And they had an actual court case over Burr's role in breaking up the Union in 1807, which he got out of by escaping to Canada and going to live in, Jeremy Bentham's house for 5 years. Like, this is drama. This is like, when you really appreciate and let that seep in, it changes your relationship to not only the past, but also like the world you're living in. How do you understand it? How do you understand the future? And when people do that, they can really cut through a lot of the fake, false narratives of like, oh yeah, Hamilton's a Rothschild lackey. You know that? Like, yeah, Burr was actually the good guy because he killed Hamilton, the Rothschild stooge. And that's actually a popular thing that's been pushed. And it's so like, you really can't understand what is driving history if you are susceptible to believing these narratives that are just thrown at, to catch flies on a little, conspiracy theory flies on a fly paper. There's so many of these fly papers around that you have to kind of like navigate through.
That latest one about nuclear war being good for climate change, I mean, that one certainly caused a hiccup, didn't it?
Yeah, that was wild.
Well, you just wonder who the hell thought that up, and why would anybody publish something like that?
National Geographic and Huffington
Yeah.
Post. Yeah.
Well, that's a Rupert Murdoch publication these days, I'm pretty sure.
I guess they went from
Which
left
kind
wing
of
to
explain,
full-blown Rupert.
which answers my question. That's precisely why. Good old Rupert.
Something to the story of Hamilton, which I had found not too long ago. That's something that I never really understood or never really looked into. But there's also Alexander Hamilton's son, second son or last son. Was Alexander Hamilton Jr.
Oh yeah.
And he actually became a lawyer, and in the end, the Aaron Burr's second wife divorced him, and it took a 3-year trial that Alexander Hamilton Jr. Took he took the case from this old woman, and in the end, Aaron Burr basically was left with nothing, and died very shortly after he had lost his trial for divorce.
Oh, that's reassuring.
That's one of the few points of actual real justice bestowing itself on a traitor in the United States. That's
The karma bus hit in the end.
oh yeah, that was a big karma bus slam.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, good. I'm pleased to hear that.
Yeah, me too. That kind of made my
Yeah,
day.
that was a nice little bit of information at the end there, Pascal. Thanks very much.
Mhm.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, no, it's great. I was happy to learn that also.
Well, I'll walk away from today with that little bit of information. That will cheer me up just a little bit more than otherwise. Yeah,
Yeah,
karma does work.
yeah, it took a long time, but Aaron Burr died in 1836.
Yeah.
And that was it. Yeah. Mhm.
Yep.
I mean, unfortunately, Burr did get to see the destruction of Hamilton's National Bank in that case, because that was also, I think, destroyed in 1836 too, or 37. No, 36, because it was the bank panic of 1837. So in that sense, there was still a certain bittersweetness to that story, because yeah, Andrew Jackson, who was the guy who provided his manor as the headquarters of the Burr conspiracy in 1807, it was in Burr's house, Andrew Jackson's house, that Burr was conducting his conspiracy to break up the Union.
Mhm.
That is how he was always part of the Burr machine, as was, well, there were a few people, but Burr was the guy who, when he came back from Britain, was the first person to say, okay, Andrew Jackson is the guy who we're going to put our resources behind when we reconstitute our machine, and make him the president so that he can destroy. We killed Hamilton, the person, but we still have to kill his national bank and the broader system of protectionism. So there was a little bit bittersweetness there, which is the right thing, because if it was just a closed story with a happy ending, we wouldn't really be in this mess right now. And there's a lot more for us to do right now. We've got a lot of responsibility because of that unfinished little story.
Yeah, if people want to read on that, I'm gonna put the link in the chat.
That's cool. War history online. That's awesome, man. Good. Yeah, Hamilton. Pascal, a little Freudian slip, is preparing a little presentation in 2 or 3 weeks as well, which is going to shed some more light on the Hamilton-Jefferson dynamic and some of the stories behind the scenes, which is going to be fun.
Are you studying this formally, Pascal?
I've been doing some presentations in the past on the subject, and I'm going to be reviewing that.
You're not doing a PhD or something like that right now?
No, it's not.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Pascal is a history professor, though.
Okay. Yeah.
His job.
That's nice to know.
It's still going to be a while before this can get into the actual schools, but until then, we got to do what we can do.
Mhm.
All right, guys. So yeah, next week we'll have a LaRouche document picked out. It's going to be good, and we'll let you all get that in the next few days to read ahead if you'd like. And otherwise, this Sunday we have Adam Sedia, who will do one, maybe the first of 2 presentations on the topic of the Articles of Confederation. The Plato, he's going to get into some Plato, what Plato was doing with his laws 2,000 years before the American Revolution, and how important the innovation of constitutional law was coming out of the Constitutional Convention to correct some of the errors and problems of the Articles of Confederation that would have caused the United States to be destroyed very early on and not really get out of the cradle. So that'll be this Sunday at 2 p.m. So if people have friends or family who you think might get something out of this, feel free to share the link with them as well.
Very good.
All right.
Well,
Okay,
thank you for
everyone.
today. Thank you, Matthew.
All right, good night,
catch
all.
you Next time.
All
All
right.
right,
Have a good night.
Okay.
cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Gute Nacht. All right.
Did you turn your recording off?
I should probably do that, eh?